And just before the commercial break, we did bring some comments from Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem. She was at Miami's International Airport just yesterday on Saturday, and she was talking about airport security, airport travel going forward, but a lot of the questions that she took had to do with immigration enforcement operations, and that's where we want to turn to next. So federal funding is ending today on February 1st for several sanctuary cities. I want to talk about this a little bit more, what the impact is from all of this. So joining us now to discuss is Jimena Bustillo. She is a reporter with NPR focusing on immigration and the Department of Homeland Security. Jimena, good morning.
Good morning.
So let's just start with a breakdown here for our viewers. What is a sanctuary city and how do city officials designate it? What is that process like?
Yeah, I mean, this gets really tricky. There is no exact legal definition of a sanctuary city, but, really broadly talking, the term has been used to describe or define any city, state, or county that limits its cooperation with federal immigration authorities. And so, an example of this could be a city whose police department are not necessarily enforcing themselves federal immigration law, if they pull someone over. And so legal questions here are really nuanced. Local law enforcement cannot block federal agents from doing their jobs and their work, but courts have said that state and city officers can withhold some cooperation, in terms of whether their specific officers are the ones doing the work. And we have seen this definition change a little bit even during this Trump administration. You might remember that at the very start of the year, the Homeland Security Department and the Department of Justice were tasked with creating a list to, really pinpoint what are the places we're talking about. They created the list, very quickly took it down because there were many mayors and sheriffs that were confused as to why they ended up on the list. And then they redid the list, and there is now a new list published by the Department of Justice. And so roughly we expected those jurisdictions to be impacted, but we still aren't really sure who's going to be impacted.
So we are taking a live look here out of Chicago in Illinois. Chicago is one of these sanctuary cities. We also know of New York City being one of them as well. But Jimena, what other major cities are part of that list?
So, many cities you might expect. Minneapolis is on that list, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Seattle, a lot of major metropolitan areas. And then, since this does cover counties as well, some other counties across the country in red and blue states.
And then I want to talk about some of the policies within these cities and how that could benefit undocumented immigrants or just immigrants that have come here rightfully so. I mean, what does that list entail in terms of those policies?
Yeah, again, it really varies depending on the city. So again, these laws or policies, I guess we should call them at times, don't prohibit federal immigration law from being enforced. So federal immigration law typically is carried out by the federal government. A lot of sheriffs, police departments actually don't necessarily want to be involved in being the one to detain someone on federal immigration authorities, because they say that can, reduce trust in local policing. It can prevent someone from calling 911 if they live in a mixed status household, if they think that, if they do that for, an emergency, a domestic violence situation, a natural disaster, then they might end up getting detained on federal immigration law. But, we have seen more cities and states really promote what's called 287G. And that's essentially where a city can do the opposite and do a very proactive partnership with the Department of Homeland Security to enact federal immigration law. We've seen this particularly out of Florida. So the state essentially has mandated that local jurisdictions do work with federal immigration authorities. We've also seen this out of Texas, where Governor Greg Abbott has essentially allowed its local police departments to enact and carry out federal immigration work.
Speaking of some of these cities and states that cooperate with this kind of enforcement, I want to put up here a social media post from Eric Schmidt. He says the deportations must continue. Sanctuary cities must end. We don't need fake comprehensive reform to enforce the law we already have. Illegal entry is a crime. Enforce it. No theatrics, no apologies, no amnesty, just enforcement. It is the only way through. But keeping up with this and the fact that this federal funding is ending, and this, of course, was pushed forth by President Trump as he continues that immigration crackdown. It was one of his campaign promises. Jimena, do we have a dollar sign amount as to how much money is allocated to these cities from the federal government?
We don't, because we don't necessarily know what programs are going to be impacted. I think we have to remember that the federal government is kind of like a sprawling funding octopus. It has funding, out of USDA that helps rural development and, schools. It has, of course, the education department, which assists schools in urban and rural areas. We see money for healthcare. We see money for utilities, for broadband. Of course, right now, many states are dealing with the winter storm. And so we are seeing FEMA and natural disaster funding. And so there really are so many pockets of dollars that could be affected. There are many arguments here that are being made for and against this. Many mayors are currently in DC for a large mayor conference where there have been several panels on immigration enforcement and many questions raised about the 10th Amendment also, and the division of powers between the federal government and what the federal government can essentially, makes local governments change in their policies in exchange for funding. That's not necessarily something we haven't seen before. Way back in the past, we have seen the federal government withhold, certain policies or certain funding dollars in order to, get highways made and kind of things like that. So this is a newer iteration of that, but it still raises the questions of, to what extent can the federal government say that what a state or a local town is doing is punishable or should result in funding getting stripped.
See, that's really interesting because that was going to be my next question, is if legally the federal government can block these cities from receiving this money just because they are sanctuary cities. Of course, you just said, there's still questions from that. This is very new territory that we are charting at this moment. But I'm wondering, though, if we do have an answer as to how sanctuary cities could push back on this and what kind of, preemptive measures they have taken just to make sure that they can still remain a sanctuary city even without that federal funding.
I think we have seen lawsuits related to this already crop up, even starting really on in the second Trump administration. We did see funding get impacted if they deemed a program to be related to DEI, for example, so diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that also had a very broad and non-legal definition. And so we saw states see their funding being impacted by that policy that you wouldn't think was funding that would be impacted. And so, I think it really depends on what dollars are exactly that are going to be lost. And I think, to kind of answer two questions in one is we can definitely expect many lawsuits to come from this, and it'll be in the hands of the court, whether or not money continues flowing while those legal battles play out or whether it doesn't.
As someone who reports on this extensively, you're obviously following along with the different arguments made from both sides of the aisle. So what kind of debates are you seeing here from Republicans, from Democrats, from cities, from states, the federal government when it comes to this issue as a whole?
The Trump administration really wants as many resources available to it in order to enact a mass deportation policy. And I think that we have seen very early on this target on particularly Democratic jurisdictions that they see as, a perceived threat or a perceived limit to that. We see that fight very, very clearly in Chicago and in Minneapolis. But, we also see these Democratic areas argue that they have the right to create a separation between the federal government and state governments in terms of their laws and policing and enforcement. And in terms of whether or not federal immigration enforcement can still be enforced, it definitely can be. And, there are many other ways that the two can work with each other while still having that that perceived separation. Again, I think it's really important to remember that the term sanctuary city or sanctuary jurisdiction, it's not a legal term. It's not something that you can just necessarily declare. And so I think that makes it really easy for both sides to, for a lack of better terms, manipulate the term, and kind of use it to whatever they say is limiting them or helping them best.
A lot of the focus the past several weeks has been on these blue states. And even when we talk about sanctuary cities, I mean, they're mostly located in these blue states. So, we've been seeing Minneapolis, these raids. Also saw the same thing in Los Angeles. Chicago is on high alert as well. I want to focus, though, before I let you go, on these red states. You had mentioned briefly before that places like Florida, places like Texas, they are already working with immigration enforcement officials. They have their local law enforcement there helping within those efforts. But what are we seeing on the ground in terms of, even possible protests? Are we seeing the kind of dynamics that we're seeing in Minneapolis? Is the fact that we don't have so many live images from those places of protests or rallies, for example, does that mean that really there's nothing going on in terms of immigration?
No, I think immigration is happening in all 50 states. And, when you have a place like Minneapolis, where it is arguably, a smaller city, compared to LA or Chicago, and it currently does have 3,000 federal agents inside of it conducting enforcement, you are going to see outsized events, news, situations, protests. Same thing with New York, right? Like I cover immigration courts, and we've seen outsized attention to the New York courts when it comes to ICE agents and officers making arrests in really intense scrums and, very intense visuals out of the immigration courts, even though some of those instances are still happening in immigration courts across the country itself. So, to say that things are not happening in other areas is definitely not necessarily true. Red states are being impacted. We saw that really large federal enforcement worksite operation happen out of Georgia that impacted the Hyundai plant. We saw meatpacking plants in Nebraska get impacted. There was a very large raid that was led by the FBI, but did result in over 100 immigration detentions in Idaho. And so, we are seeing this happening in red states and blue states. I think people on both sides of the aisle are protesting in all those states as well, for more immigration enforcement, as well as against the tactics that are being used. And, I think it's that across country reaction that has resulted in a slight shift in Washington, particularly when it comes to the current federal shutdown and how Republicans and Democrats are moving forward with trying to negotiate some sort of changes to how ICE operates.
This is a live look that we have out of New York City, again, another sanctuary city. One more question, though, Jimena, when it comes to the red states. Obviously, a lot of Democratic leaders, they are not for how these immigration operations are being carried out. We've seen some Republican leaders be a bit more forthcoming when it comes to providing that help to ICE or CBP. Any Republican leaders that are leaning more toward this Democratic side that they say, no, this is not the way to handle it, and they're also pushing back?
Yes, yeah. I think we're kind of seeing everyone on all sides, really grapple with this. Democrats, did not land the immigration messaging in 2024 and are trying to find their footing in doing so ahead of the midterms this year. And just as these tactics have been escalating in many of their jurisdictions, but we are seeing, Democrats say we want a secure border, we do want immigration enforcement, but their focus is on the tactics and how that enforcement is carried out. And then at the same time, we're kind of seeing this on the Republican side as well. They're saying immigration was a winning issue for us in 2024, and we're losing public sentiment on this. Nearly every poll shows that public sentiment in at least the way that ICE is operating is dropping. So the public wants immigration enforcement, wants border enforcement, but does not want to see U.S. citizens, being killed or being detained, or certain classes that are supposed to be protected, like DACA students, or those with temporary protected status, necessarily lumped into this as well. And so that is causing Republicans to, in a sense, take a pause and say, is this what is our winning message? How can we stay winning on immigration coming up to the midterms in 2026?
Jimena Bustillo, a reporter with NPR focusing on immigration and the Department of Homeland Security. It's always a pleasure to have you here to help break down all of these headlines when it comes to immigration enforcement. Take care.
Thank you.